Uh,
Well,
Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Bridge Lunch Break event. My name is Jackie Garrett, Fund Development Associate at Bridge Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news in Michigan. In this hour, we'll be discussing the impacts of electric vehicle production and use on Michigan's environment and economy. Our special guest panelists will include Bridge Business Reporter Paula Gardner and Bridge Environment Reporter Kelly House. Bridge Executive Editor Joel Kurth will moderate this discussion. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Joel will lead that discussion with Paul and Kelly for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please type any questions you have for our panelists into the chat window at any time. If you're not a panelist, pretty please remain muted throughout today's discussion. We are recording today's conversation and it will be posted on Bridge Michigan this week. You can subscribe to our newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and click subscribe. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join this membership community, we will drop a link to do so in the chat. And a friendly reminder, please stay muted throughout the conversation. I will now pass it over to Joel to get us started.
all right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And Paula and Kelly both have done superb work all year on Michigan's transition to electric vehicles. I hope you check it out at bridgemi.com, specifically about where we are in infrastructure, both in terms of switching. I learned this week a new phrase, ICE plants, those are internal combustion engines, to electric battery powered ones, which require billions of dollars in subsidies, as well as where we are with the charging network. Again, I hope you all check it out, and we're really eager to get started. So let's do it. Paula, can you give us an overview of where we are today in Michigan and nationally on EVs and what the trend lines are, what percentage of vehicles sales they compose, and where we think it's going?
Sure. And actually, I was just kind of preparing today for this call and realizing that things are still pretty much changing by the day. There's a lot going on. Every month, the sales figures change. Every month, the market share changes. Policy, we've got hints of those changing. Jobs are changing, but overall, there's still a sense that BEVs, battery electric vehicles, will be about 7% of the market this year. And that's essentially flat. When you see a lot of the statistics, you will see fantastic percentages of automakers, increasing, decreasing in the double digits. But it's still, we're talking a very small amount. And also, however, um, hybrids are starting to play more in the mix. They've been a pretty small share of American vehicles thus far, but plug-in hybrids are starting to be a bigger part of the market share, and they're sometimes pulled into the EV numbers. So you might see numbers that say EVs will be 16% of the market this year. That actually is including the plug-in hybrids. So it's very complicated. It's a very moving picture, but that's essentially what's going on.
You're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was trying to be polite, and there I go, causing our first technical snafu of the day. What are we seeing on the ground in terms of how pricing and incentives are a factor? We heard a little bit earlier on that price, the sticker shock was a factor for folks. But can you tell us what the bottom line is now in terms of what is forcing people to buy? Prompting people to buy or not buy EVs.
There's some very attractive rebate offers out there that are trying to equalize the pricing between ICE and BEV. Um,
Hold on there. What's BEV?
all battery electric vehicles.
All right. Let's get our
Overall,
straight.
overall, the electric vehicle market, electric vehicles are basically more expensive today. And we've got a lot of promises out there that that's changing, and a lot of hints that it's going to change even further. One example in Michigan is there's a cheaper form of an electric vehicle battery that will be made in Marshall by Ford Motor Company. And that's something that their CEO has said will help make EVs profitable for Ford. So that's changing rapidly, but it's also changing overseas as the Chinese automakers figure out how to deliver cheaper vehicles. But there's no getting around the fact that cars overall, light duty vehicles or light vehicles are more expensive than we've ever seen. Roughly $50,000 for an average. It's probably somewhere, a couple thousand below that. So when we're talking about expense, the EV is more, but everything is more.
Sure. I was just at a car lot dropping off my car, and I saw cars for $100,000, which is baffling. So everything's more expensive. But quickly, and obviously, in order to make this transition, we need battery plants in Michigan. You've done a lot of reporting on incentives in Michigan to help this conversion. What have you found, and what's the latest? Can you give us an overview on that?
That's changing rapidly too. There have been a lot of promises made in the forms of money through incentives and from the auto manufacturers who say, how many jobs they'll be delivering in exchange for that money. What's happening though is that there's overcapacity across the market for EV batteries right now. Some of these battery factories actually will be producing large scale battery storage, not for EVs, which is interesting. We The jobs, the hiring is slowing down. The open dates are being extended. I think there's potential for what I've already reported to be updated soon, possibly with still some more extensions of opening dates for the factories that in most cases we're supposed to be hiring and opening very shortly.
The headline I think that grabbed me was that so far Michigan spent $1 billion on EV and battery plants and created 200 jobs roughly so far. Is that correct still?
So far, yeah. When there's a recent announcement that the federal government will be supporting some ICE transition in existing automotive factories, and one of them, of course, was in Lansing at the Grand River Assembly Plant, and that made me check the Ultium hiring. There's one position, or at least there was last week, one position open at the Ultium factory, and again, that was supposed to be opening fourth quarter 24, and that's it so far.
And why is that? Why is it going so slow?
It's that overcapacity. The automakers, as they're putting the brakes, and I like using a lot of automotive words here to describe what's going on, but they're putting the brakes on a lot of the EV production as they realize that they're going to have too many vehicles,
Hmm.
not enough demand, and that's a real problem. It's a problem also on the consumer side because these cars, well, that's a whole other thing, but like if you're a consumer and you want to buy an EV, the car you buy today is going to be more expensive and probably be less technologically advanced than the one that you will buy 2 years from now. So whatever they're selling today, the residual values will also be a problem for the automakers as they come on the secondary market in many cases when they're off lease.
So it sounds like still early, even though we've been talking about EVs now for 10 plus years, we're still kind of talking about early adapters a little bit, right?
We
Um,
are.
Governor Whitmer's obviously been leading a charge about incentives and helping the automakers switch to electric vehicles. What is at stake for Michigan in the future here?
Michigan's manufacturing base is at stake. As the world switches to EVs, and I say that recognizing that there are some political promises out there to slow it down further. But as the world, at least in the U.S., as the world shifts to EVs, um, the whole manufacturing landscape is changing, and Michigan still counts on automotive for manufacturing jobs. So there's a lot at stake for what Michigan can hold on to for its livelihood. Basically, I
Mhm.
just read an article. Georgia is like very proud of overtaking Michigan in job promises among EV
Yeah.
factories, and they say they are the dominant player now. in
Wow.
automotive.
So even all these years later, as the big three go or the Detroit three go, so goes Michigan.
All these years later. Yep.
Mhm. And how is the United States auto industry competing globally on EVs?
That's changing too. I think, the Chinese manufacturers are on fire. They're charging full speed ahead, and they have reasons to do so. They're underwritten by the Chinese government, but uh, the manufacturers have to make choices about where they're building cars and where they're selling cars. There's China, there's Asia, there's the Indian market, which is also emerging. There's Europe, which is also slowing down right now. The sales there are slowing down. And then the US. So when you think about Ford and GM, there was a time when GM sold most of its vehicles in China, and that's no longer the case. So their market is getting smaller. Their global market is getting smaller.
And the record profits that we heard from last year, those are not from EVs, I would assume, right?
They are not from EVs. EVs are a real drag on each of the automakers at this point, and they require a big upfront cost. The outlays to set up a battery factory are enormous, and that money comes from somewhere, So they're building those in anticipation. So it's a balancing act for the automakers.
Still making a ton of money off internal combustion engine cars, losing money on EVs, trying to transition. You have the Republican Party this week saying that they're going to passing a platform to basically roll back all those incentives. What are you as the business editor of Bridge Michigan going to be looking at over the next 6 months? What should we as consumers look at?
That's a great question, Joel.
That's
Uh,
right.
um, I'll be looking at the overall industry. I'll be looking at some of the best projections I can find. There are a lot of people out there who are slicing and dicing numbers for sales, market share, and things like that. I'll be looking at that for insight into what that means for mostly Ford, Stellantis, and GM. Um, I'll be reading some international news and looking for hints at what some of the international players might be doing because they're also investors here. I suddenly have to keep an eye on China. I have to suddenly keep an eye on South Korea. Um, and I'll be watching which cars actually take off or not. I
Mhm.
think the Ford Lightning is one of those vehicles where, like you said, that the auto companies are making money on cars. They're actually making money on trucks, at least particularly in the case of Ford. And watching the big launches and how they click, I think will be very telling because you can do the math on capacity. You can figure out where factories make sense and where they don't if you spend a couple days with it.
Okay. One last question for Paula before we turn it over and ask some questions to Kelly, who's been super patient. And then we're going to get to some reader questions as well and talk about some exciting stuff that you both are going to be embarking on soon. Um, is this transition an inevitability? We have, it seems like there's a big campaign issue right now among Republicans to really they feel like they have a winning issue on fighting this transition. Is this going to happen one way or another, or is that still yet to be determined?
I I would think in some ways it's yet to be determined. Globally the train has left the station. And in the US, it's interesting to see people wanting to stop it. Although I found myself thinking just this morning, like, why not? Why isn't it a good option? We're essentially replacing jobs in many respects. There are some pain points. Gas stations are a pain point, but they're adapting. They're selling pizza now. And when I talk to them for previous stories, it seems like they're ready to further adapt. And there's still an element of choice out there. So, part of my thought is, what is ultimately why not? Why wouldn't we?
For sure. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Kelly. Paul's done a great job giving us an overview on the business end of this. There's also obviously a lot of environmental factors. And from that perspective, Kelly, what are the motivations behind the push for EVs?
I mean, it's climate change, right? And in Michigan, because we have such this close economic connection to the auto industry, that part often gets overshadowed. But um, you know, transportation sector is the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in our country. The family car is a huge part of that. Um, and we're under a really tight timeline to bring emissions down dramatically, or, the global consensus amongst climate scientists is that we will be seeing some really catastrophic effects of climate change. Um, and I think, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, why not public transportation? Why not, driving less? Why the focus on EVs? I think a big part of that is it's much easier to change the technology that people use than to ask people to change their entire lifestyle. And we're trying to do it in a matter of like a few years at this point. We have until mid-century if we're going to avoid some of the climate tipping points that, are sort of the fear factor motivating this. So that's why you're seeing federal policies that are requiring automakers to dramatically slash their emissions. And that's why part of the reason why you're seeing commitments from the automakers themselves. They have their own sustainability pledges and goals in addition to the pressure that's being put on them politically and regulatorily.
Super interesting. One of the things that I'm hearing about more often is this sort of dichotomy that in order to save the earth with electric vehicles, you have to do more damage to the earth. Certainly, batteries come with their own environmental trade-offs. Can you speak to those?
Yeah, there are several places. I think the one that gets a ton of attention is the critical minerals issue. Electric vehicle batteries need sometimes different materials or higher quantities of materials that we already use, copper being a good example. Cobalt and lithium are some of the other big critical minerals. And in many cases right now, the US isn't mining a lot of that stuff. So a huge portion of mining is happening in countries that may not have the same environmental and human rights regulations. So you're seeing places like the Congo, where cobalt mining has been associated with child labor, with pollution in mining communities from mine tailing and like the smelting of mining. So those are real issues. I think the counterpoint that a lot of experts would make too is that you also have those supply chain abuses happening in traditional automotive in different ways. But that's part of why you also see this push to onshore. Another reason is sort of national security concerns, but you're seeing this push to onshore the supply chain of critical minerals, which then is creating tension in mining communities in the US. So you're seeing that start to bubble up a lot in Minnesota, a lot out west, and in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which obviously has a mining legacy. There's renewed mining exploration happening there. And in some cases, Paula's written a lot about a copper mine that's being proposed in the area near the Porcupine Mountains. And so, communities understandably look at those and fear that the same kind of environmental consequences we're seeing in other countries, or that we have seen in the past in our own country inflicted by the mining industry, may happen again.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, you talk about that supply chain piece, but there are also lots of conversations happening around the plants themselves. And again, I think history informs some of the concerns of today. The automotive industry in Michigan and in the US and the world does not have a great historical track record of leaving host communities as clean as they were found. And Paula and I did a whole project last year on the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in contamination that have been left behind by automakers that still haven't been cleaned up. So, again, no surprise that communities are seeing these new plants and asking for more reassurance from automakers that they will be conducting their operations in a way that doesn't pollute.
Terrific. One of the factors that you've written about with EVs, and I think one of the reasons people are still a little reluctant to purchase them is the so-called range anxiety, which is the fear of finding the next charger. Can you give us an overview of where we are in Michigan in terms of charging stations, how much the state has spent, what we're looking for, and what we need?
Yeah. So, first I'll just say range anxiety really comes into play with road trips. For the average driver, 9.5 days out of 10, you are not going to drive, if you're an EV driver, beyond the battery range of your vehicle. And so if you have access to charging at home, day-to-day driving, a lot of EV owners I've talked to have said it's actually more convenient because they never have to stop for gas. On road trips, it's a totally different story. America's public charging network is really in many ways still in its infancy, and you see that most acutely when you get away from the cities, which people do on road trips. So in Michigan specifically, this is a national issue, but we have about 3,400 public chargers in our state. State officials estimate we need 100,000 by 2030 if we're going to get to the point of 2 million EVs on the road. Obviously, more will be needed if we're anticipating making a full transition, because I believe 2 million is like a quarter of cars on the road in Michigan. So we need to be building like 40 some a day. Last year, we added a little more than 300 the entire year. So there's this ongoing push to fix that problem. It's a known problem. There's been a lot of conversation about it. But the challenge is these things can be expensive, especially the fast chargers that get people back on the road, within a half hour, as opposed to the slower ones that you're sitting there for, 4 to 8 hours. So the state of Michigan itself has put money up for this. The federal government has distributed billions across the country, including 110 million in Michigan. And here, so far, we've spent 30 million in state and federal dollars and have about 90 million left to spend. And in addition to that, lawmakers in the recently passed budget allocated another, I may be getting this wrong, I think it's 30 million spread between chargers and other priorities. So unclear exactly how much of that will go to expanding the charging infrastructure, but some of it will. And, on top of the state spending, in many ways, energy utilities are like the biggest player in expanding the charging network. They are subsidizing public charging to the tune of like tens of thousands of dollars per fast charger in many cases, because for them, obviously more people using electricity instead of gas equals more customers. They can profit off the build out of those chargers, and more customers sharing the load reduces the per kilowatt price of electricity for customers.
So we're still sort of at the infancy right now, it sounds like. Just as a point of clarification too, you said we want to have 2 million EVs on the road by 2030. How many are there on there now?
Oh, the exact number I have in my email inbox, but when I checked a couple of months ago, it was like close to 50,000. It's like 0.5% of cars on the road today.
Okay. And we expect, though, that the next 5 years, there really could start having a snowball effect and a lot more happening, right?
Yeah. And I think it's a feedback loop, right? If there are enough chargers for people to be confident, more people will buy cars. Price is a factor too, as Paula has already mentioned. If people don't feel confident, and seeing chargers visible in their community as a component of that, then those sales projections could be off. So I think it's really dependent upon not just, sales aspirations and expectations from automakers, but also whether or not everything's in place for consumers to feel like they are confident buying these things.
Right. You too, and it seems like one of the factors in being able to get over that lack of confidence is this road trip problem. You guys seem like you're talking a lot about road trips. What is going on with bridge and road trips?
We're gonna take one.
What?
Yeah, yay! Road trip. Which anyone watching today, you can look on our website. Paula and I and our colleague Asha are going to be heading out next Monday, and we want readers to come along with us. So we want your suggestions. We want your questions about EVs. We want to know where the best ice cream is. It's going to be sort of a mix of traditional reporting, where we're testing the EV charging network out firsthand. We're going to see what a road trip looks like in an EV. We're going to do reporting on the energy transition along the way, but we're also going to be doing reporting on, all of the things that we know and love about Michigan in summer. So hoping to talk to people, hoping to get input from readers and viewers on where we should go and what we should do. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. Paula?
Yeah, I agree. It's the interesting thing is, like, we're trying to be prepared. Neither of us drives an EV, so we're trying to be smart, but not too smart, because this is a trip of discovery, and we want to share our discovery with readers as we figure it all out, even at a campground, which I feel very brave about.
Discovery too is going to be discovering what kind of car you have, right? I just saw a question in the chat right now. We don't know. We're not going to know till you pick it up, right?
We are not going to know. I know I sound like I'm wasting bridge money, but we've reserved a luxury SUV. And the reason for that is there's three of us going.
On this call right now.
Oh, sorry. You would be surprised at how few vehicle specifics are available when you're trying to rent an EV. And I felt like I needed something large enough for 3 people, large enough for 3 sleeping bags, and something that felt kind of roadworthy. And like that was my option besides the Chevy Volt. So when I tried to get specific.
And just to be clear, I mean, this is not, you guys are going to be taking 5 days. I think the trip is roughly replicating along the shore of Lake Michigan up through Menominee down to, I'm going to butcher all these names, somewhere in Wisconsin where you can take a ferry.
Manitowoc.
But we acknowledge up front, this is not an ideal road trip. I already got 1 email saying, hey, listen, this is a trip I'd make in a day and a half. You guys are doing 5, tipping the scales. We're tipping the scales a lot of ways. We're acknowledging this is not perfect. We're also not getting intentionally a Tesla, correct? Because Teslas are much farther along in terms of the charging network than some of these other cars that people are suggesting. So it should be a lot of fun. I hope you all survive. We can't afford to lose you. Let's go to reader questions now. There's been a ton in the comments, and we had some earlier on. So we're going to do our best to be working our way through them. If we don't answer all of them, we apologize. But I do think that this exercise has been really affirming in letting us know this is an issue people care deeply about and are very curious about. So quick right off the bat, we have a reader who asked whether releasing only the most expensive versions of new EV models first hurts sales. Anybody want to take that?
That's an interesting question. You mentioned $100,000 recently. It's like the Tesla Cybertruck just passed the Ford Lightning, which, everybody in Ford probably had indigestion over that. But it also set a record for like $100,000 truck sales. So there's a hunger out there for the expensive vehicles. I'm not exactly sure who has that hunger, but of course, many people are also leasing them, which is a slightly different financial situation. It might hurt them. I think GM was surprised when the Bolt took off, thanks in part to incentives when they were going to cut production of it. There's clearly a market for lower priced ones, but they're all looking at high prices right now.
Right. What we did have a question in the chat about some concerns about manufacturing lithium batteries, especially in Marshall because it's so close to Kalamazoo River, and there was an oil spill there not long ago, I believe. We've heard about some fires with plants in houses, especially with electric bikes. Can you speak at all to the safety concerns that some folks have?
Yeah, well, I think you just hit on one, the fires issue. Um, they do happen with the cars themselves, but studies have actually shown that fires in electric vehicles are less common than fires in gas cars. So that one's sort of a myth.
Mm-hmm.
The plant contamination concern, you know, as noted, we've seen some accidents already at plants. We see accidents at, internal combustion engine related plants too. So I think part of it is we don't know a lot yet. These facilities are just getting up and running and don't yet have a track record.
Mm-hmm.
And again, people are operating on information they already know about manufacturing in America, which is that, I live a couple miles away from a former GM plant that is unusable right now because it's totally polluted with PFAS and other contamination. So manufacturers would say, look, we have stronger environmental laws now, we're adhering to standards, and we will contain all of our pollution. But the fear comes from historical experience and uncertainty because we don't really have a lot of information yet. And many of the facilities in Michigan, Paula, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but since they're not built yet, like there's precious little permitting information yet about what will be used on some of these sites and how it'll be disposed of. So again, so early in the process, it's really hard to say if they're better or worse, but the concerns are, realistic.
Yeah, when it comes to vehicles, it's like those LFP batteries, which have no cobalt, and they'll be built at the Ford Marshall plant. They're supposed to be like less risk for fire in vehicles themselves, but the factories and everything else, that's one of those things I Google every now and then, and you find incidents where you realize that as reporters we need to be actually figuring out a plan to watch all of that, as consumer advocates should be doing too in their communities, because it is so unproven, but it's going to unfold before us.
Um, Quick question about that, and I'm going off script, so I apologize. You both mentioned the work you both did on the industrial legacy of Michigan, leaving these big moldering plants for taxpayers to clean up. Paula, nobody has covered the state agency that doles out these billions of dollars of incentives more thoroughly, or really at all, but mostly better than you in the past, several years. As Michigan rolls out these incentives, billions of dollars of incentives to these companies to transition, are any extra precautions being written into them to learn from history?
Not that I'm seeing. I hear talk about it when we talk about incentive reform. I use the word "we" too often, as a proxy for Michigan. But as legislators talk about incentive reform, they have talked about communities and what's being left behind and watchdogging, that sort of thing. But I'm not. It seems to me like it's still boilerplate, and it doesn't deal with specific contaminants that are on the property, and what happens next, and what are the risks there, and how will things change in 5 years about what we know about this, like with PFAS. Nobody was ready for that. I think at this point in the game we should know that there are things we should be ready for.
Mm-hmm. But the bottom line, it seems like these plants are so coveted that we're not really doing anything differently, right?
Not that I'm seeing.
Okay. We have a lot of questions regarding the Tesla plug and their availability in gas stations. I'm wondering whether or not you can speak to that, Kelly, if we know when that's coming. But also, as you answer that, can you talk at all about some of the calculations that gas station owners are making as they prepare to invest money into these chargers that can run, what, $134,000 a piece?
Yeah, the fast chargers. And that's just the portion that the state has been spending with a match from, the host. So I would say upwards of $150,000 per plug.
Mhm.
Yeah, as for Tesla chargers, they are, Tesla has agreed to like open its parts of its supercharger network to other vehicle manufacturers. Certain vehicles, adapters are already available for owners. I don't know, Paula, maybe you do, the specifics about like if and when, manufacturers will just be building that plug point into the cars, and if there's a set timeline for that.
I don't remember the latest. There was an announcement. I believe something changed.
Yeah, so, but parts of that are ongoing. And for some, drivers of non-Tesla vehicles, they can already get an adapter to plug in. As far as businesses deciding whether or not they want to host these, as part of the story I did, just looking at how far we are on public chargers, I talked to a gas station that has one. It was subsidized, so I think that helps. Right now, basically, by and large, businesses are not just deciding that they themselves want to spend $500,000 adding a fast charger. It's happening because there's state money available, or they can get a $70,000 rebate from a utility or whatever. But this guy kind of said, it gets used like once or twice a day. It's not really bringing me business right now. That's okay because it's not costing me money. But his vision, this was in the Lansing area, so there are more EV owners and more traffic in general. He was like, I think it'll pay off in a couple of years. Like, I'm making this investment thinking into the future. If you are a business in, some town in the middle of the UP that has 400 residents and has maybe a surge of tourism in the summer, but probably very few to no EV drivers stopping there in the winter, the calculus is going to be different, right? And those are probably going to be the places where it's harder for a business to make the case for themselves to host a charger.
Sure.
But, in Traverse City, where there are tons of EVs, in Grand Rapids and Metro Detroit, the calculus is getting easier and easier.
You mentioned there's tons of EVs in Traverse City and some places like that. We'd have a question about Michigan's comparatively low penetration rate of EVs and what you think it's going to take to change that, and in whether consumer incentives, state-sponsored consumer incentives, are part of that equation.
I do know, I wish Lauren Gibbons was on the call right now, because our colleague who wrote about the budget, but I know that there were some proposed consumer incentives that by the governor that were ultimately left out of the budget.
For 3 years running, I believe.
Yeah, so that's an ongoing debate in Michigan that so far hasn't had traction. And I'm sorry, I missed the other half of your question.
Oh, just what you think it's going to take for Michigan.
Oh,
It's not real big early adopter so far. It was
yeah.
a $2,000 rebate that was, oh, no, I'm sorry, that was from 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think the incentives definitely cost, these are still expensive vehicles, and I don't know that this is a factor, but Michigan is not a particularly wealthy state. So I think for every state cost matters, but perhaps more for states with lower average incomes. Charger access is a huge one. And, part of it is you reach tipping points when there are enough EVs on the road that your friends and neighbors see their friends and neighbors driving an EV and, see it as less scary or more appealing.
So we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
We had another question regarding the whether Michigan is exploring ways of replacing the gas tax. Michigan has an 18-cent tax on gas per gallon that primarily funds road construction. Does anyone want to tackle that?
There was discussion on that a couple of years ago, and I don't remember where it went, but people were saying basically, like, why are we going to keep taxing with gas when there will be these other cars on the road? And And actually, it was interesting because like when we were talking about incentives to kind of reach the tipping point with EVs in Michigan, it just kind of like hit me in the gut. You know, it's like incentivizing to build and incentivizing to buy, and it just seems like, you know, there's such a public component there. Just a side thought.
As I recall, I think there was a study done regarding a roads traveled fee, miles traveled fee. I think Oregon has done a pilot program on that. Part of the issue with that, I think, which is difficult, is that it requires the placement of a tracker in your car and giving information over to the government. And I also think that Michigan's also done some studies on toll roads, which traditionally are more of an equitable, you know, if you want the fast lane, you're going to pay a little more for it. But frankly, it neither seemed to be going anywhere. A question about whether the media is being lobbied by big oil and big energy.
I mean,
Yes.
the simple answer is yes, the media, you know, we get lobbied by interest groups on all lobbying. It depends what you mean by that word, but, you know, we are out there to listen to people who are stakeholders in the issues we cover, and then, you know, present a fair assessment of their views while also, you know, presenting facts, right, as the core of our story. And so, you know, when you think about it in that perspective, yes, I am lobbied or, you know, constantly talking to people who want me to see their side of an issue, whether it be, you know, fossil fuel interests, advocacy groups, businesses, you name it. I hope that answers the question.
Does it work? Are you bought and paid for?
I'm not bought and paid for. No, Bridge is nonprofit, nonpartisan, and you know you can look up our ethics policies on our website if you're curious.
Soon we'll be.
Oh, I'm sorry. Coming soon.
Yes, we are adopting an ethics policy, but you can also look up all of our funders over $5,000 online and look at all of our other policies, soon to be followed by the ethics policy. That is a lot of information. Can either of you discuss? We have a lot of questions. I'm trying to distill some of these equity issues in terms of racial and also wealth equity as it relates to you know, who is going to go first with chargers and other infrastructure. As you know, the country has a history of from the railroad to the freeway of issues regarding equity in infrastructure, and whether history is now repeating itself with charging networks.
I think history is repeating itself. I had a conversation with a friend recently who drove to Ann Arbor from downriver, and I was telling her what we were doing about the EV road trip, and she just volunteered that they tried to get an EV and they found two public chargers. You know, there are certain areas where people think they will not have EVs, and you know, things are a little bit different. Is basically her message, and I haven't had a chance to actually look into that, but like she was trying, and I mean, EVs, just by the nature of the pricing and the needs, you know, if you have a garage, you've got an edge. If you can have, you know, a charger installed, you've got an edge. If you can afford a $70,000 car or a $100,000 truck, you're at the top of the line. And that's just the way it is right now. I do think it will be interesting as models diversify a bit. And again, the secondary market is like as resale, you know, as they start to make their way down the resale and used car buyers start to find EVs as a reasonable option, you know, things could start to change.
I can speak to the charger aspect of it. You know, there's this huge glug of federal money that's funding chargers at 50-mile intervals along highways. There is an overlay related to, you know, the Justice 40, Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative on that. So there is some, you requirement there for placement to also align with communities that are disadvantaged in various ways. There's also some work going on, again, as I noted, utilities are doing a lot of the subsidizing of chargers in the state. And they're regulated by the state, and there are certain requirements and or voluntary, programs that they're doing around specifically subsidizing like at-home charging for people who are below a certain income level, or placement of chargers in multifamily housing, which obviously, tends to be folks who can't afford to own a home. So there's not nothing happening around that, but certainly there could be more conversation about, what to do about it. And it's communities that, inhale the most, right, pollution from gas-powered vehicles, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, unfortunately, are in many ways likely to be the last ones to benefit from owning electric vehicles for reasons beyond the chargers too.
Right. We have a lot of folks in the chat reminding us that Michigan does charge a little extra for the registration every year for EVs. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it compensates for the lack of gas taxes that are being paid, but it is definitely something. We mentioned earlier that the Republican National Committee passed a platform vowing to roll back EV incentives. We have a question about why this issue is so politicized, and I was hoping that as we answer that, could you address concerns about job losses, because they're not non-existent, correct?
They are not non-existent.
You say never use a double negative.
Exactly.
They exist. There's some legitimacy to the questions about job losses, right?
Well, there's job shifts, and the shifts aren't just in numbers or location. The numbers are probably kind of equalized in some respect. But there will be more workers who install electrical lines and infrastructure instead of working on pipelines. There's some equality there in the types of jobs to generate. There's factory jobs still. The education is going to be different. The job requirements, I don't think we completely understand if the pay will be different. So there are a lot of kind of similarities, but differences. Yeah, job losses, job gains. And I don't mean to minimize that. That's a big deal for people. And that's why Michigan was so worried about losing its engineering base, and also its factory base. But it's complicated and capable of being close to equalized at a time when we do have record low unemployment, is how I personally look at it.
But to that point, though, I mean, this is an issue for Donald Trump, especially because it's based in some real fears, right? I mean, Michigan is specifically Southeast Michigan's wealth is built on the back of mechanical engineers who will not be needed as much with EVs. And certainly there's fewer parts. I know there's studies kind of go back and forth, but studies, the most recent I see say 30 to 40% less labor than gasoline cars. To your point, obviously the new jobs are going to come and change this, but there's definitely a shift, and anytime there's a shift, that's frightening.
Yes, it is. I think part of it is with EVs is that it's obvious and more quantifiable than other technological job shifts that we've seen in the past. We were not all attuned to the steel industry moving overseas, but the steel mills started to close. And, it's just a more obvious, and it's on a timeline. And I think that makes it scarier. And along with the other unknowns, we don't know what they'll pay. We don't know where those jobs will be compared to where the jobs are today. We don't know, what the education value is of the jobs and if we can even meet them. There's a lot of unknowns.
For sure. Well, we're running a little low on time, but we're going to stick with Paula because we cannot end hour-long conversation about EVs without talking about Goshen. What is new with Goshen? Can you get us caught up on that? Talk about politics. Wow.
Well, you caught me. I have not looked on the federal court page yet, or the court page yet today or this week. But Goshen is suing Big Rapids Charter Township. And there are a lot of things right now on hold and moving back and forth. And what's become clear as Goshen has launched a PR campaign to try to directly tell the public what it plans. At the same time as it's suing the township, and community activists are challenging all of that. What we know is that it's on hold. We know that there's a date coming up soon where they're going to have to figure out some things. The township was successful in getting the court to revisit the order that said that it could not keep Goshen from moving forward while the court was making its decision in the overall lawsuit. So it really is moving back and forth, like everything with EVs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a lot of ways that one is interesting because it's not just EV batteries. It is larger energy storage too, and it's in a more rural area and not replacing jobs. Although I guess that could be said about Marshall too. It's greenfield, brand new, and we can watch every single step of it.
Very interesting. Before I turn it back over to the very capable hands of Jackie, I'm just wondering whether you both have final thoughts as you are about to embark on this 5-day road trip, what you're going to be looking for, and how folks can follow along on your epic odyssey.
My final thoughts, and something that probably came through in this conversation, is, both Paula and I have learned a ton about, the industry and the infrastructure and everything else over the past year, but there's still a ton to learn. And I think, like the average Michigander, as someone who doesn't own an EV, a huge part of it is going to come down to, is the experience enjoyable, or at least comparable or tolerable compared to what you're doing now? So I'm just really excited to get a sense of, the high points. I've heard that EVs are really fun to drive because they have instant torque, and the low points when it comes to maybe trying to charge in the middle of nowhere and struggling with where we are on our build out.
I thought the hardest part was going to be deciding what cheeseburger to eat from all of our awesome reader suggestions. Paula, how about you?
Remind me of the question.
What are you looking forward to? Final thoughts, either on the road trip or on the subject in general?
Oh, I'm really looking forward to just having the experience of driving the EV and making all of the decisions. I used the word discovery earlier, and I think that's a big deal of what I'm looking for. And also, dang it, we get to do it in Michigan in the summer. What an amazing opportunity.
No, it's amazing that you have such a benevolent employer that would pay you to do that. I should say too that I see the other member of the Bridge Michigan Power Trio, Asha Lewis, is on the call. We should acknowledge her, and I look forward to following you along, and I hope everyone does. We have an active Instagram account. We have an active, we're going to be starting a tracker. We're going to be having a lot of fun with this as well. And I do think you guys should stop at Clyde's for burgers in St. Ignace. That's my tip. Jackie, back to you. And thanks to everyone else for joining us. It's been really, the hours flown by, and clearly there's a ton of interest on this issue. And we're so grateful that you joined us. The Instagram account is, we'll put it in the chat.
And just to quickly chime in, a lot of this content will be easily accessible on the Environment Watch and Business Watch newsletters. So if you're not signed up, that's a good first step.
All right, back to Jackie. Thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Paula, Joel, and Kelly. And again, thank you so much to all of our viewers here, all of our dedicated readers. Reminder that we'll actually be posting a recording of today's program on Bridge Michigan's website, app, and social media channels this week. And our August event will be announced very soon. So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for listening so intently, and you all have a wonderful day.